Hola, soy Gabriela Supelano y les doy la bienvenida a este capítulo de Entrespecies. Este episodio va a ser una especie de experimento distinto a los demás. Ha habido algunas ocasiones en las que tuvimos la oportunidad de invitar a personajes muy interesantes, pero no lo pudimos hacer porque no hablaban español. Hace unas semanas me propusieron entrevistar a este invitado y quise hacer el experimento porque no quería perder la oportunidad. Por eso, hoy les traigo a Antoine Godin de la Agencia Francesa de Desarrollo. Eso quiere decir que toda la conversación entre los dos será en inglés. Espero que algunos de ustedes la puedan disfrutar y también les pueda funcionar para practicar su inglés. Godin es investigador de la AFD y economista y se ha dedicado a realizar modelos económicos para abordar la transición ecológica. Me parece muy interesante traer a este podcast a un economista que está investigando precisamente esa relación entre economía y medio ambiente, sobre todo en lo que se relaciona con el cambio climático. Hablamos sobre los modelos económicos que él ha realizado para la AFD, sobre todo el modelo que realizó para Colombia, y también sobre el estado y la importancia de la transición ecológica en el mundo y en Latinoamérica. Aquí está mi conversación con él. Antoine Godin, thank you for being here in Entrespecies. And today we're going to talk about ecological transition and economics. This is new for this podcast, but I'm really glad that we are touching this subject. So before we start, I want you to tell us what is ecological transition? What is it and why is it so important in this moment?
First of all, thank you very much for having me in this podcast. It's really a pleasure to be here. Well, the ecological transition is really about transforming the way in which humankind as a society sees its connection with nature. If you want, we can think about the relationship between humanity and nature in two ways. On the one hand, we are dependent on services provided by the environment in general, what we call ecosystemic services. Think about having clean air or water or access to nature and so on and so forth. So that's the dependency side of the relationship between nature and humankind. And on the other hand, we are exerting pressure to the nature because we are emitting CO2 we are emitting CO2, we are polluting, we are using water, we are using resources. And so the relationship between humankind as a whole and nature is about understanding the dependency and the pressure that is exerted by economic activities, by human activities. And so the ecological transition is about reducing the pressure that we are exerting on nature and increasing the resilience we have about the dependency to nature, so that whenever there's climate change or there's natural events, we are capable of continuing to live in a decent way with nature. So this is really about changing the way in which we interact with nature, ensuring that we protect the nature, and on the other hand, we are less impacted when there are climate events or natural events.
And why is it so important to talk about ecological transition right now?
Well, we have seen it this year. The Earth has never been so hot. We have had very strong events of heat, more than 50 degrees in Northern Africa or in the Middle East. Well, actually, Colombia is just starting to have a very strong El Nino phenomenon. So we are in a situation where clearly nature is sending a signal that we have been exerting too much pressure in general. We can see this also in terms of precipitation that are reducing in the northern side of Africa, also in Europe, or we have other sides where we have strong precipitation events with flooding and so on. So clearly we are in a situation where nature is sending us a signal that we are living in an unsustainable way, and we need to change that. So this is really why we have to change and start an ecological transition.
And it's really clear for many of us. I'm right here in Cali, and the heat is becoming very unbearable, and the city is not prepared for this kind of heat. So I'm wondering if these changes are producing an impact on governments, on policymakers. What are you seeing from where you work, from the AFD? If this is making people who are in charge being more aware of the need to make this transition?
Well, you are right in saying that it's about making us more aware, because it's been more than 50 years that we actually talk about ecological transition. The Limits to Growth report from the Club of Rome was in the 1970s. The concept of sustainable development is appearing in the 80s. We have had 27 COPs already. So the meeting where all the governments are meeting to talk about how to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases and talking about adaptation. But what is surprising right now is that the climate change is going much faster than we had anticipated. So I think what is catching the attention of policymakers is that, yes, we knew we were exerting too much pressure. And of course, it's been in the scientific debate, it's been something that we've seen for a very long time. But now it's going faster than we had anticipated. And when you read the IPCC report, so the report produced by this intergovernmental panel on climate change, every report is becoming more and more alarming. And even though we as a society and all of the government have pledged to reduce the CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emission to reduce climate change to only 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, currently all of the commitments that the government have been making are not sufficient to attain that target. So the new COPs, the next one, which is going to take place in Dubai in a couple of weeks, is really important to make sure that we, again, as a society, acknowledge the fact that the efforts that we are making are going in the right direction, but they have to be emphasized and they have to be more ambitious to ensure that the Earth stays a living place for all of us.
Yes, that's true. So you are an economist. Why is economics, why is it so important that this discipline is also participates in this ecological transition?
I like your question because it's asking about why is economics participating with others, and exactly. This is a difficulty that we, as an economist, we often find is that usually economics is seen as the center of all policy making. Because there's a good reasons, right? Because of course we live in a globalized world with a lot of international relationship, and of course economics is extremely important to generate employment, to generate income, and so on and so forth. But what is important is that if you think about the ecological transition, it's really about making different disciplines talk to each other. It's about ecology, biodiversity experts. It's also about social aspects, how to ensure that the ecological transition is a just one, so that people that might be negatively impacted because they are losing jobs or because they are losing income are protected, and so that everyone is actually benefiting from the just transition. So economics, because it's at the center of most of the political debate, has a role to play, but it also has a role to play with others. And this is really something that the French Development Agency is really pushing forward, is how to ensure that the sustainability is attained in economic terms, of course, but also in ecological terms and in social terms. Otherwise, we have seen this in France, for example, with the Yellow Vest movement. When you have a too strong ecological movement, sometimes the social aspect is not respected, and hence the transition doesn't take place. So if you really want to ensure a sustainable world for everyone, you have to ensure that all of the aspects of sustainability, economics, ecologics, and social, are respected. And this is something also very important for Colombia as well.
And one of the things that you do in the AFD is develop these economic models that help us see transition. But before we talk about those specific models exactly, I want you to try to explain to us, people who maybe don't have an idea of what an economic model is, what is it? Because for us, it sounds like something very complex, very technical, but it's used by policymakers every day. So what are economic models?
the simplest way I can describe an economic model is really a list of equations, mathematical equations, that are supposed to represent the economic dynamics. So, for example, you could think, okay, how can we represent consumption of households? What are the determinants of the evolution of consumption? One, we could say, well, it's about income. If you have higher income, then you'll have higher consumption. Someone else could say it's about wealth. If you are rich, then you will consume more. But it's also about preferences. For example, some people might like better to consume transport or tourism. Others might like to transport more food or computers and so on and so forth. So the idea of economic models are really about representing behaviors in mathematics, so using equations. And then these equations are entered into informatic software, which then simulates and say, okay, if I increase my income, then consumption will increase, and when consumption increase, income increase for someone else, and so on. So you have these kind of feedback loops. Now, with economic models, there are different ways. Either you can see something about forecasting. It's really about understanding what will be the evolution of economy in the very short term. And so central banks, for example, are very interested in that. They try to understand, okay, how inflation is going to impact or change, or how financial institution will evolve. Sometimes it's about more long-term perspective, about understanding what are the long-term perspective of the evolution of an economy, what kind of industry will grow, what kind of employment will emerge, and so on and so forth. So you have different types of models used by different institutions, also in academia, developing these mathematical tools and so on and so forth. So it's really about understanding the evolution of economics in general. And this is where it's interesting, because you can have then introducing social aspects or environmental aspects or different type of political aspects. And so these models are then adapted to the questions that we are trying to answer.
So now let's talk about the models that you are working with in the AFD that specifically talk about this ecological transition. What are you putting in these models? What are you looking at in these models?
Right. So before I respond exactly to your question, you have to understand that the French Agency for Development, the AFD, has committed, is really a commitment from the French government to say, we want to help everyone who's interested to achieve this ecological transition. It's part of the Paris Agreement and from the idea that this is a common objective. It's not every country individually. It's really all together that we are to achieve this objective of the ecological transition. And so the goal of the project that we are developing at AFD is really to help the different countries in responding to the questions that are related to climate change or biodiversity protection. And depending on the question, we are going to use this macroeconomic model that really talks about the evolution of an economy and connect it to ecological aspects. So, for example, in the case of Morocco, we are trying to understand how droughts and the fact that climate change will imply less precipitation in the country leads to different outcomes in terms of agricultural production. And then if you have less agricultural production, what are the consequences in terms of inflation, in terms of production, in terms of imports and exports, and so on and so forth. In the case of Colombia, we are developing the model with respect to the international and domestic energy transition. So as you can see, we have different types of questions, and the goal of the model are developed by coupling, that is connecting two models. So we have a macroeconomic model that talks about the macroeconomics, and then we couple it with a model that represents the specific question. Agriculture in the case of Morocco, energy in the case of Colombia. And what is important for us is that these economic models and these what we call sectorial model can represent the biophysics of it. So if you talk about agriculture, you want to understand how the plants evolve, because this is really important. Otherwise, economics, remember we were talking about why is it important that economics is there. I said it's because it's connected to others. If you leave only economics, then you don't represent the reality of the physical representation of this. So this is why we are doing this coupling between a sectorial model and an economic model.
And have you learned things about Colombia? Do you have findings yet? What has the model told us about this energetic transition that we are trying to look for as a country?
Yes, well, of course, I didn't need to tell you that, but you know that Colombia is a country which is very dependent on energy exports. It's exporting petrol and coal, and these are like representing 50% of the exports, which is a very important share of exports. So one of the key questions is about how can Colombia diversify, move away from being so much dependent on coal and petrol exports and start doing other exports. We could think about agriculture, we can think about tourism, we can think about hydrogen and so on and so forth. So this is one of the key questions that Colombia is facing. And it has many different repercussions. If you think about it, so I talked about exports, but it's also about finance. There's a lot of financial investment coming from the rest of the world into Colombia that are going towards the mining sector of coal and petrol. So again, this is important for Colombia because Colombia needs to have foreign currency coming into the economy so that they can also import other goods and services, say computers or cars. But it's also important for the government. A very large share of income from the government is coming from flows coming from the mining industry in the form of royalties, regalías, or in the form of dividends from Ecopetrol, or in the form of taxes being paid by this industry. So you can see that there are different ways in which the dependency of fossil fuel is exerting impacts onto the economy. It's a really tough challenge. Of course, policymakers in the country know that, and the new president Petro has committed itself to move away from this, and so it's something which has really well understood. The model that we have been developing shows the kind of challenges that Colombia will be facing, and we can provide different scenarios to respond to that. So what if we have different form of financial investment coming from Colombia into Colombia to diversify? What if Colombia manages to start exporting different types of goods? So we are doing this scenario in partnership with DNP and with Hacienda to think about, okay, how can we best accompany this moving away from petrol and coal exports so that Colombia remains into a sustainable growth path? A second question that we are facing is how to do a domestic transition. One of the key questions about Colombia is that if you look at the energy consumption in Colombia, a strong part is coming from transport. Because of the geography of Colombia, because of the size of its cities. If you look at Colombia, at Bogota, it's 11 million people. It's massive. So a big question is how do we make sure that transport is less dependent on fossil fuel and more electric? But it's true also on electricity. It's true on many different aspects. So here what we are doing is we are trying to develop different scenarios of different technologies you can use. So you can use electric cars, you can use more public transports like metro or trams, and so on and so forth. So the goal of the exercise that we are running right now is to try to understand different scenarios of domestic energy transition and understand, again, is it the case that it's the government that has to do the investment? Is it the case that it's the private sector? Can the banking sector how can the banking sector in Colombia help? How can international institutions like the World Bank help, and so on and so forth? So it's really about trying to understand all of the different aspects of the transition in terms of fiscality, in terms of finance, in terms of impacts, in terms of job. Is the social protection mechanism of Colombia good enough so that it can absorb the difficulties that might emerge because you might lose jobs in the coal sector? So you think that we have to really think about all of the different aspects of the energy transition and to design policies that respond in the best way and make sure that we leverage the opportunities and mitigate the risks and the vulnerabilities.
And how are you perceiving this change to cleaner energies? I heard in a recent podcast in the New York Times that this transition is surprising some scientists because it's being a lot faster than what they thought. Is this being perceived?
It is being perceived. In these dynamics, we really talk about tipping points. Is it the case that at some point because there's a lot of theory that shows that, for example, cycling is interesting. So until there's 20% of people in a city cycling, we don't perceive this because we don't see them too often. But once 20% of people have started to cycle, then everyone knows somewhat, oh yeah, but I know that guy, he's been cycling, or I know that person has been cycling. And then there's a tipping point, and you can see that there's an acceleration in the process. So I think this is really interesting. We are in a tremendously interesting time because everyone is perceiving the fact that we need to do something about transition. Of course, it's difficult. There's a lot of tensions, and as we said, we talked about the Yellow Vest movement, for example, in France, but plenty of other example. But at the same time, because the movement has started, we are close to a tipping point, or at least to some extent. Of course, there will be lots of challenges, especially in developing and emerging economies, where you also have to develop the economy. There's a lot of questions about inequality, poverty reduction. So you really have to perceive the transition very differently in developing and emerging economies rather than in Europe or in the US, right? So this is why it's so interesting, because every country is different, but you can see this acceleration, and this is something very, very interesting. And something else that I wanted to mention, for example, is that we are doing projects in different countries. I was mentioning Morocco, also in South Africa. South Africa is similar to Colombia because it's very dependent to coal, and now we are trying to build bridges between the Colombian project and the South African project, so you can exchange about, okay, what are your experience about just transition, so that you can leverage what South Africans have been doing and what Colombians have been doing, and hence have this South-South cooperation, which is extremely interesting. So that me, as a northerner, I can stop and leave it up to you guys.
But that is really interesting, the connections between these countries. And you answered the question that I was gonna make, which was, what is the difference between being a developing country and having to face climate change and do an ecological transition, and the bigger countries and bigger economies. And just, if you want to add something, I don't know.
I might, because I think this is something very important. This is why AFD has decided to develop, and if you think about it, it's unusual that a development bank like AFD has spent so much time on developing a model. It's because we really want to be able to understand the criticalities of the country in which we work, and this is why we always do partnership with the country, because of course I have some technical capabilities, but in the end I will never know as much as well as our partners about the reality of Colombia, Morocco, Tunisia, and so on and so forth. That's one point. The second point is that if you look at it, most of the research centers are usually in the north. And of course, because they are from the north, they have a vision about the transition from a developed economy, from a mature economy. And the question that you might ask about how France should change or the US should change is not the same as the question that you would ask when you talk about Colombia, South Africa, or Turkey. And so this is why it's very important that there's capacity building and South-South cooperation, so that the questions that are relevant for the countries will be responded in a way which is adequate to the countries, and so this is why it's I think it's, for me, it's extremely interesting, because I get to meet a lot of people from different countries, but also because I think we are going to be able to answer to the question in a much better way than if we weren't doing this.
And to end the interview, I want to ask you something a little bit like more personal about what you are thinking right now. Lots of people are feeling a little bit of losing hope. Especially I see it with my students or younger people who seem to feel like everything is just going wrong and there's no solution. And I want to ask, how are you feeling? Are you optimistic? Are you being more of a realist? What do you think about this moment?
It's a tough question, and I have that a lot. I teach also in different programs, and often it comes to that. Well, I'm ambivalent. Of course, I'm worried, and I think we should be. It's clear that us as a society in the world, we are failing this, and we can't talk a lot about responsibilities, but it still remains the fact that currently we are not capable of responding to the challenge that we are there. There are a lot of very interesting initiatives that are emerging, and of course the political debate is gaining a lot of momentum on this, but currently we are not doing enough. So So what do I do personally? Well, I try to combine this perspective because I really like the job I'm doing, and I think it's crucial. And as I was saying, I get to meet a lot of interesting people, and so creating these links, making sure that people have empathy with the others is very much it's fulfilling, and on top of this, it helps in trying to do a transformative transition. On the other hand, we need to keep the pressure on the politicians so that policymakers actually are enacting and following up on the promises they have been making. Because if you hear about it, there's a lot of promises about this, and everyone has understood that we need to do something. And us as a society, as scientists, as just civil society, we need to add the pressure onto our government to ensure that yes, they respond to the promises they have been making. And I think there are signs of this. Certainly in Colombia, I can clearly see. I've been coming here for the last 6 years, and I can see that in the previous government and in the current government, there has been a commitment to try to change. Even though Colombia is certainly not responsible for the historical emissions, and yet the commitment politically and the ambition has been very strong. So I think this is why there is hope. But let's keep the pressure to ensure that the hope transforms into a reality. No?
That's good. Pressure and hope. I like the both of. Antoine, thank you so much for being here in Entrespecies, and well, much success to you and to the AFD in all of this work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Espero que hayan disfrutado de esta entrevista y del experimento. Si les parece que funciona, puedo hacer de vez en cuando, y cuando el invitado lo amerite, alguna que otra entrevista en inglés. Quiero agradecerles por escuchar durante toda esta tercera temporada de Entrespecies. También quiero contarles que el próximo año voy a estar ausente por un tiempo porque voy a entrar a licencia de maternidad durante la primera mitad del año. Pero ya estoy preparando la cuarta temporada y volveremos al aire a mediados de 2024. Si tienen temas y personajes que quieran recomendar para el podcast, pueden enviarlos a lasaga@elespectador.com. Recuerden, lasaga@elespectador.com, la saga es con Z. Y por Twitter o Instagram me pueden escribir a @GabrielaSupelo. Gracias a Antoine por la charla, a ustedes por escuchar, y que los economistas interesados en el medio ambiente siempre nos acompañen.